My sister ghosted me for 12 years. Then she showed up 8 months pregnant, asking me to carry her next baby. My sister Vanessa stood on my doorstep at 9 o'clock on a Thursday night, 8 months pregnant with her hand on her swollen belly. And the first words out of her mouth were, "I need you to be my surrogate." I hadn't seen her in 12 years. Not at our father's funeral, not at our grandmother's wake, not when I got married or divorced, or when I almost died from sepsis last year. 12 years of complete silence. And now she wanted my uterus. I laughed in her face. It wasn't a polite laugh either. It was the kind of harsh bark that comes out when someone asks for something so absurd your brain can't process it any other way. Vanessa's face went red and she started crying immediately, real tears running down her cheeks while she touched her pregnant stomach like she was protecting the baby from my reaction. She said she understood I was angry, but this wasn't about us. It was about saving a life. I asked whose life needed saving when she was clearly about to pop out a kid any minute. She wiped her nose with the back of her hand and said this baby was fine, but she couldn't carry another one. And she desperately needed me to carry her second child because I was the only family she had left who could help her. The logic made zero sense, but before I could tell her to leave, my boyfriend Keith appeared behind me asking who was at the door. Vanessa's eyes went huge when she saw him, and she actually took a step backward off my porch. Keith looked at her pregnant belly, then at me, then back at her, clearly confused about why a heavily pregnant stranger was crying on our doorstep at night. I introduced them flatly, saying this was my sister Vanessa, who I hadn't spoken to in over a decade. Keith's eyebrows shot up because I'd mentioned having a sister exactly once in the 2 years we'd been together, and I'd made it clear she was dead to me. Vanessa tried to smile at him through her tears and said it was nice to meet me finally, that she'd heard so much about him. I asked her how the hell she'd heard anything about Keith when we hadn't communicated in 12 years. She got this guilty look on her face and admitted she'd been following my social media accounts from fake profiles, keeping tabs on my life even though she never reached out. The creepiness of that confession should have made me slam the door immediately, but Keith invited her inside because he's too nice for his own good, and it was starting to rain. Vanessa waddled into my living room and sat down on my couch without being asked, making herself comfortable like she'd been here 100 times before. Keith offered her water and she accepted with this grateful smile that made me want to throw something. I stayed standing with my arms crossed, making it clear this wasn't a social visit and I wanted her gone as soon as possible. She launched into her explanation without any preamble, saying she'd gotten pregnant with her first baby through IVF because she and her husband had fertility issues. The pregnancy had been complicated from the start with severe preeclampsia that nearly killed her at 7 months. Her doctors told her another pregnancy would be too dangerous, that her body couldn't handle it. But she and her husband desperately wanted 2 children, and they had 1 frozen embryo left from their IVF cycle. She needed a surrogate to carry that embryo. And after considering all their options, she realized I was the perfect candidate because we shared DNA, and I'd already proven I could carry a healthy pregnancy to term. I stood there processing the absolute audacity of her request, while Keith looked between us with growing concern. I reminded Vanessa that I'd never successfully carried a pregnancy to term, that I'd had a miscarriage at 14 weeks 3 years ago, and the trauma had contributed to my divorce. She had the decency to look embarrassed for about 5 seconds before saying she was sorry for my loss, but medical records showed I'd been able to conceive naturally and carry to 14 weeks, which proved my uterus worked. The clinical way she talked about my devastating miscarriage like it was just data for her argument made my hands shake with rage. Keith put his hand on my shoulder and suggested we all take a breath before continuing this conversation. Vanessa nodded enthusiastically and said she knew this was a lot to process, that she should have reached out sooner to rebuild our relationship before asking for such a huge favor. I asked her why she ghosted me in the first place, what I'd done that was so terrible she couldn't even tell me where she was living for over a decade. She went quiet for a long moment, staring at her hands in her lap, before saying it was complicated, and maybe we could talk about it another time after I'd had time to consider her request. That non-answer told me everything I needed to know about her priorities. She didn't want to explain or apologize or repair our relationship. She just wanted my body. I told Vanessa she needed to leave and that my answer was no, absolutely not, never going to happen. She started crying again, harder this time, saying I didn't understand how desperate she was. Her husband wanted 2 children. They'd spent tens of thousands on IVF. This embryo was their last chance. She couldn't use a stranger as a surrogate, because the screening process took months and cost a fortune they didn't have after all the fertility treatments. I was her only option, her only hope. Keith squeezed my shoulder gently, and I could tell he was feeling sympathetic toward her, which annoyed me even more. I asked Vanessa to explain why I should help someone who abandoned me without explanation, who missed our father's funeral, who couldn't be bothered to check if I was alive or dead for 12 years. She wiped her face and said she knew she'd hurt me, that she'd made mistakes, but this wasn't about the past. This was about an innocent baby who deserved a chance at life. The manipulation was so obvious it made me sick, but Vanessa kept going. She said she'd do anything to make it up to me, that she'd pay me, she'd sign any contract I wanted, she'd be the sister she should have been all along. I told her actions had consequences, and she couldn't just show up pregnant and expect me to forget everything. She nodded frantically and said she understood completely, but would I at least think about it? Keith walked Vanessa to the door while I stayed in the living room trying to calm down. I heard them talking quietly in the entryway but couldn't make out the words. When Keith came back, he sat next to me and said Vanessa had given him her phone number in case I changed my mind. I asked him if he was seriously considering this insane request. He said he wasn't considering anything, but Vanessa was clearly desperate and pregnant, and maybe I should at least hear her out before making a final decision. I stared at him in disbelief. We'd been together for 2 years, and he knew the basics of my family history. That my sister had vanished from my life with no explanation, and that the abandonment had damaged me deeply. Now he was suggesting I should help her because she showed up crying and pregnant? Keith backtracked immediately, saying he didn't mean I should agree to be a surrogate, just that maybe I should talk to her about why she disappeared before slamming the door on any possibility of reconciliation. I told him Vanessa had 12 years to explain herself and chose not to, so I wasn't interested in her explanations now that she needed something from me. He dropped it, but I could tell he thought I was being too harsh. The next morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and 32 text messages from a number I didn't recognize. The messages started reasonable enough. Vanessa apologizing again for showing up unannounced and asking if we could meet for coffee to talk properly. Then they got progressively more desperate around 3 a.m. She wrote that her doctors had told her she only had a small window to transfer the embryo before it wouldn't be viable anymore. She said she was running out of time. She needed an answer soon. The last message said she was sorry for everything, for disappearing, for hurting me, for not being there when I needed her. But she was begging me to please consider helping her. I showed the messages to Keith over breakfast, and he winced at the 3 a.m. timestamps. He asked what I was going to do. I said I was going to block her number and pretend this never happened. He looked like he wanted to argue, but stopped himself. I could see the judgment in his eyes, though. The unspoken belief that I was being cruel to a desperate pregnant woman. That judgment bothered me more than I wanted to admit. I blocked Vanessa's number and tried to go about my normal life. I worked my shift at the dental office where I was a hygienist, came home, made dinner with Keith, watched TV, went to bed. But I couldn't stop thinking about her showing up on my doorstep. The audacity of it. The entitlement. 12 years of nothing, and then she wanted me to carry a baby for 9 months, go through pregnancy and labor, risk my health and my life, all because she'd decided I was her best option. The anger kept me up at night, replaying our conversation over and over in my head. 3 days after blocking her, someone knocked on my door at 7 o'clock in the morning while Keith was already at work. I looked through the peephole and saw Vanessa standing there, still massively pregnant, holding a manila folder. I didn't open the door. She knocked again and called out that she knew I was home because my car was in the driveway. She said she just needed 5 minutes to show me something important. I yelled through the door that she needed to leave or I'd call the police. She pressed her face close to the door and said she'd brought medical records proving she couldn't carry another baby safely, that this wasn't manipulation or exaggeration. Her life was actually at risk if she tried to get pregnant again. Something in her voice made me open the door, probably because I needed to believe my sister wouldn't lie about something that serious. Vanessa looked exhausted, with dark circles under her eyes and her hair pulled back in a messy ponytail. She thrust the folder toward me and I took it reluctantly. Inside were hospital records, doctor's notes, lab results, all confirming severe preeclampsia during her current pregnancy and explicit recommendations against future pregnancies due to high risk of maternal mortality. The medical language was stark and frightening, talking about potential seizures, stroke, organ failure. If this documentation was real, another pregnancy could actually kill her. I looked up at Vanessa and she was crying again. Silently this time, tears just rolling down her face while she stood on my porch. She said she knew she didn't deserve my help, that she'd been a terrible sister, but she was desperate. I asked her again why she disappeared. What had I done that made her cut me out of her life so completely? She took a shaky breath and said it wasn't what I'd done. It was what Mom had done, and she couldn't explain it properly standing on my porch. Could we please sit down somewhere and talk? I let her in against my better judgment. Vanessa sat at my kitchen table while I made coffee. Neither of us would drink. She kept rubbing her pregnant belly in this absent-minded way that made it clear she'd been doing it for months. When I finally sat down across from her, she started talking without looking at me. She said Mom had done something unforgivable when Vanessa was 23, something so devastating that Vanessa couldn't stay in contact with anyone who remained close to Mom. That included me. I reminded her that I hadn't been close to Mom either, that our mother had always been difficult and our relationship had been strained at best. Vanessa shook her head and said it was different, that Mom had told her something that changed everything, and Vanessa couldn't be around me without constantly thinking about it. I asked what Mom had possibly said that justified 12 years of silence. Vanessa's hands tightened on her belly, and she said Mom had confessed to her that I wasn't Dad's biological daughter, that Mom had an affair when she was pregnant with me, and Dad had raised me thinking I was his, but I wasn't. Vanessa found out the truth and couldn't handle it, so she ran away from the whole family rather than face the lie every day. The words didn't make sense at first. My brain couldn't process what she was saying. I sat there staring at her while she cried and apologized and said she should have told me years ago, but she didn't know how. She'd been a coward, and now here she was asking for my help when she'd kept this massive secret from me. I asked her if Dad knew. She said she didn't think so, that Mom had only told her during a drunken breakdown, and then begged her never to mention it to anyone. Vanessa kept the secret for 2 years before she couldn't take it anymore and just disappeared. She'd moved across the country, changed her phone number, blocked everyone on social media, started over. She watched Dad die from a distance knowing he never learned the truth about me. The betrayal was layered and complex. Not just Vanessa's abandonment, but Mom's lie, and Dad's unknowing acceptance of a child who wasn't his. I asked Vanessa who my biological father was. She said Mom never told her, just said it was someone she worked with, and the affair ended before I was born. I felt like I was floating outside my body, watching this conversation happen to someone else. Keith came home from work early and found us both crying at the kitchen table. Keith made us actual food while I tried to process everything Vanessa had told me. She'd brought her medical records but also dropped a bomb about my parentage that rewrote my entire childhood. Keith kept looking at me with concern but gave us space to talk. I asked Vanessa why she thought I'd want to help her now after learning she'd kept this secret for 12 years. She said she knew it was wrong, that she should have told me immediately, but she'd been so angry at Mom and so confused about what to do that she'd handled it in the worst possible way by running away. Now she was trying to make amends, trying to be honest, trying to give me the truth even though it made her request for surrogacy seem even more impossible. I appreciated the honesty, but I also resented the timing. It felt like she was only telling me about my parentage now because she needed something from me, like the truth was a bargaining chip. She swore that wasn't the case, that she'd been planning to reach out for years but kept chickening out, and then she got pregnant and realized time was running out. Her due date was 3 weeks away, and if I agreed to be her surrogate, they'd need to transfer the embryo within 3 months of this baby being born for optimal success rates. I told Vanessa I needed time to think about everything she'd told me, both the surrogacy request and the revelation about my father. She nodded and said she understood, that she'd wait for me to reach out when I was ready. Keith offered to drive her home since she was so pregnant, but she said her husband was waiting in the car outside. I asked why he hadn't come in with her. She looked embarrassed and said he didn't know she'd come here today, that he thought she was at a doctor's appointment. Her husband apparently didn't agree with her plan to ask me for help because he thought it was too much to ask of someone she'd abandoned. The fact that even her husband thought this was inappropriate made me feel slightly vindicated. After Vanessa left, Keith and I sat in silence for a long time. Finally, he asked how I was feeling, and I told him honestly that I had no idea. The parentage revelation was bigger than the surrogacy request, and I didn't know which thing to process first. Keith suggested I call my mom and ask her directly about what Vanessa had told me. I said I'd rather die than talk to my mother right now. I spent the next week in a fog, going through the motions of work and life while my brain spun in circles. Keith tried to be supportive, but he clearly had opinions he was holding back. On day 8, he finally said what he'd been thinking, that regardless of how I felt about Vanessa's abandonment, helping her carry a baby could be a way to rebuild our relationship and create something positive from all this pain. I asked him if he seriously expected me to spend 9 months pregnant with my sister's baby after learning she'd hidden the truth about my parentage for over a decade. He said when he put it that way it sounded crazy, but from another angle it was a chance to save a baby's life and reconnect with family. I told him he didn't get to have an opinion about what I did with my body, and he agreed immediately but said he was just trying to help me see all the angles. That night I couldn't sleep, thinking about Vanessa's belly and her desperate eyes and the medical records showing she could die if she tried to carry another baby. I also thought about Dad, the man who raised me, who taught me to ride a bike and sat through my terrible clarinet recitals and walked me down the aisle at my wedding, never knowing I wasn't his biological daughter. My phone rang at midnight and I almost didn't answer, but the caller ID showed my mom's name. We hadn't spoken in almost a year after a fight about her drinking. I answered and she immediately asked if I'd talked to Vanessa recently. My stomach dropped. I asked how she knew about that. Mom said Vanessa had called her earlier that day, crying and asking if Mom had ever told me the truth about my father. Mom had realized Vanessa must have finally reached out to me and confessed everything. There was a long pause, and then Mom asked me what I wanted to know. I told her I wanted to know everything, starting with who my biological father was. She sighed deeply, the sound crackling through the phone, and said his name was David Brennan, a manager at the insurance company where she'd worked as a receptionist. They'd had an affair that lasted 6 months before Mom got pregnant. David was married with 3 kids of his own and wanted nothing to do with the baby. Mom told Dad she was pregnant, and he was thrilled, never suspecting the truth. David got transferred to a different branch, and they never spoke again. Mom had lived with the secret for 35 years until she got drunk one night and told Vanessa everything. I asked Mom why she would burden Vanessa with that secret instead of me. She said she didn't plan to tell anyone ever, but Vanessa had been there that night helping her through alcohol poisoning after a particularly bad bender. Mom thought she was dying and wanted someone to know the truth. After she recovered, she begged Vanessa to keep it secret because telling me would only cause pain and wouldn't change anything. Dad was my father in every way that mattered, and learning otherwise would just hurt me and destroy his memory. Vanessa apparently struggled with the information for 2 years before cutting everyone off. Mom had always wondered if that was why Vanessa disappeared, but she never confirmed it until today. I asked Mom if she ever tried to contact David Brennan to tell him he had another daughter. She said no. He'd made it clear he didn't want any involvement, and forcing him to acknowledge me would have risked exposing the affair to Dad. So I existed as an unknown daughter to a man who might not even know I was alive. The conversation with Mom left me feeling hollowed out and strange, like my entire identity had shifted slightly to the left and nothing fit quite right anymore. Keith found me crying on the bathroom floor at 2 a.m. He sat down next to me and held me while I sobbed about Dad, and how I'd never get to ask him if he knew or if he suspected, or if he ever looked at me and wondered why I didn't look quite like him. Keith said Dad had loved me unconditionally, and that was what mattered, but I couldn't get past the fact that such a fundamental piece of my identity had been a lie. The next morning, Vanessa texted from a new number saying she'd heard from Mom that we'd talked, and she was sorry for causing all this pain, but she hoped I understood now why she'd left. I didn't respond. 3 days later, a man named Dennis showed up at my workplace saying he was Vanessa's husband and could we talk during my lunch break. I took him to the sandwich shop next door and we sat in a booth while he apologized for his wife's behavior. Dennis looked exhausted and anxious, clearly stressed about Vanessa's impending delivery and her surrogacy obsession. He said Vanessa had been struggling with severe anxiety about only having one child, that it had become an unhealthy fixation. Dennis explained that Vanessa came from a mindset of needing 2 children specifically because that's what her version of a perfect family looked like, and she couldn't let go of that vision even though her body couldn't safely carry another pregnancy. He said they'd looked into adoption and traditional surrogacy, but Vanessa had convinced herself that I was the only acceptable option because of our genetic connection. Dennis had tried to talk her out of contacting me because he knew the family history was complicated, but she'd become almost manic about the idea. He was here to apologize for putting pressure on me and to assure me that if I said no, they would accept it and find another path forward. I appreciated his honesty and told him I hadn't made a decision yet. He nodded and said whatever I decided, he hoped Vanessa and I could eventually repair our relationship independent of the surrogacy question. I asked him if he knew about the secret Vanessa had been keeping about my parentage. His face showed genuine surprise. He said Vanessa had told him she and I had a falling out over their mother's behavior, but she'd never mentioned anything about my father. I realized Vanessa had kept that secret even from her own husband. After Dennis left, I sat in my car and called Vanessa. She answered on the first ring, breathless and hopeful. I told her I'd talked to Dennis and I knew she hadn't told him the real reason she disappeared. She was quiet for a moment, then admitted she'd been too ashamed to tell him she'd abandoned me over something that wasn't even my fault. She said she knew how selfish that sounded, but she'd built a whole new life in another state, and talking about the past felt like opening old wounds. I told her that's exactly what she'd done by showing up pregnant and desperate. She'd ripped open wounds that had barely started healing. Vanessa started crying and said she knew, that she'd handled everything wrong, but she was begging me to please consider helping her anyway. I asked her what she'd do if I said no. She said they'd find a traditional surrogate somehow, go into debt if they had to, but it would take months they didn't have. The embryo was already degrading and might not be viable much longer. Every week that passed decreased their chances. I told her I needed to meet her husband properly and understand exactly what being a surrogate would involve before I could even consider it. We met at a coffee shop the next Saturday, me and Keith on one side of the table, Vanessa and Dennis on the other. Vanessa was so pregnant she could barely fit in the booth. She kept shifting uncomfortably and making small pain noises that she tried to hide. Dennis ordered her decaf tea and she looked at it with disgust but drank it anyway. They explained the surrogacy process in clinical terms, the legal contracts, the medical procedures, the hormone treatments I'd need to take to prepare my uterus for embryo transfer. Vanessa had brought a folder full of information about gestational surrogacy, highlighting the sections that explained I'd have no genetic connection to the baby since it would be formed from her egg and Dennis's sperm. I would just be the carrier. The process sounded invasive and complicated and terrifying. Keith asked about health risks and Dennis handed him a different packet of information about surrogacy complications. We learned about gestational diabetes, preeclampsia, blood clots, hemorrhaging, all the ways pregnancy could damage or kill me. Dennis was surprisingly honest about the risks, which I appreciated even though it made Vanessa visibly uncomfortable. She kept trying to downplay the statistics and emphasize how rare serious complications were in healthy surrogates. I asked Vanessa directly why this was so important to her, that she'd track me down after 12 years of silence. She said she'd always planned to reconnect with me eventually, that the silence had been weighing on her, but the urgency of needing a surrogate had accelerated her timeline. I told her that sounded like she wouldn't have reached out at all if she didn't need something from me. She started to deny it, then stopped and admitted I was probably right, that she'd been too cowardly to face me without a concrete reason. The surrogacy need had given her an excuse to finally contact me. At least she was being honest. Dennis interjected that they'd be willing to compensate me for my time and medical risks, that they'd researched average surrogate compensation and could offer $35,000 plus all medical expenses. Keith's eyebrows went up at the number. I knew what he was thinking, that we could use that money to pay off his student loans and finally save for a house. But putting a price tag on pregnancy felt wrong somehow, like I'd be selling my body. I told them I needed more time to think and research and process everything. Vanessa looked disappointed but nodded. Her due date was 10 days away. Vanessa went into labor on a Wednesday night and texted me from the hospital at 3 o'clock in the morning. "Just thought you should know," the message said, with a photo of her in a hospital gown hooked up to monitors. I stared at the text trying to figure out if she was manipulating me or genuinely wanting to share the moment with me. Keith woke up and saw me looking at my phone. He asked if I wanted to go to the hospital. I said no, then yes, then no, again. We ended up going at 6 a.m. after I couldn't sleep anymore. The hospital maternity ward was cheerful and bright with murals of animals on the walls. A nurse directed us to Vanessa's room where we found her between contractions, sweaty and exhausted. She looked shocked to see me there. Dennis was beside her, holding her hand, and he looked equally surprised. Vanessa started crying when she saw me, saying she couldn't believe I came. I told her I was still angry about everything, but I didn't want to miss the birth of my niece or nephew. She smiled through her tears and said they were having a girl. They'd decided to name her Violet. The name made something twist in my chest because Violet had been our grandmother's name, the grandmother whose wake Vanessa had missed. I stayed through the entire labor, watching my sister bring a daughter into the world. Violet was born at 2:47 p.m., weighing 7 pounds and 2 ounces, screaming and perfect. Vanessa held her and sobbed with relief while Dennis kissed them both. I stood in the corner feeling like an intruder, but also feeling something shift inside me. This tiny baby was my niece, my blood relative, even if Vanessa and I were only half-sisters according to the secret Mom had revealed. When the nurses took Violet to get cleaned up, Vanessa reached for my hand. She said watching her daughter being born made her realize how badly she wanted to give Violet a sibling, how desperate she was to create the family she'd always envisioned. She asked me again if I'd consider being their surrogate. I pulled my hand away and told her this wasn't the time for that conversation. She nodded, but I could see the hope in her eyes. Over the next few days, I visited Vanessa in the hospital several times. Each visit felt easier than the last. We talked about things besides the surrogacy, remembering childhood moments and favorite foods and the time we'd gotten lost at the state fair. She showed me how Violet liked to be held and let me feed her a bottle. Dennis pulled me aside on the third day and thanked me for being there, even though Vanessa had treated me terribly. He said it meant everything to her to have family present after years of isolation. I asked him what he thought about the surrogacy situation honestly. He sighed and said, part of him thought they should let it go and focus on the daughter they had, but another part understood Vanessa's desperate need for a second child. He'd grown up with 3 siblings, and his happiest memories involved that chaos and connection. He wanted Violet to experience sibling relationships, but he also didn't think it was fair to ask me to be their surrogate given our complicated history. He said if I decided not to do it, he would support that decision and help Vanessa accept it. His honesty made me like him more than I expected. When Vanessa came home from the hospital, she called me every day with updates about Violet. The baby wasn't sleeping. The baby had colic. The baby smiled for the first time. The calls felt like tentative steps toward rebuilding our relationship. We never talked about the surrogacy directly, but it hung over every conversation like a cloud. Keith asked me 2 weeks after Violet's birth if I'd made a decision. I told him I was leaning toward no because the health risks were too significant, and I didn't trust Vanessa enough yet to literally carry a baby for her. He nodded and said that was fair. Then he asked what I thought about the money. I said the money was tempting, but not worth 9 months of pregnancy and potential complications. He agreed, but I could tell he was disappointed. We needed that money. His student loans were crushing us, and my dental hygienist salary wasn't enough to save for the future we wanted. That night, I lay in bed doing math in my head, calculating how the surrogacy compensation could change our lives. We could pay off half of Keith's debt immediately. We could save the rest for a down payment on a house. We could finally stop living paycheck to paycheck. But was financial stability worth risking my health and sanity? I didn't know. A month after Violet's birth, Vanessa asked if I wanted to come over for dinner. She said she'd made lasagna, my favorite, and she wanted to talk about everything without any pressure. I agreed to come alone, leaving Keith at home. Vanessa's house was in a nice suburb 40 minutes away, a 3-bedroom colonial with a manicured lawn and a playground set in the backyard. Inside, the house smelled like tomato sauce and garlic bread. Violet was sleeping in a bassinet in the living room, tiny and perfect. Vanessa looked exhausted but happy as she served dinner. Dennis joined us and we ate together like a normal family, talking about nothing important. After dessert, Vanessa finally brought up the surrogacy. She said the doctor had confirmed their embryo was still viable, but they needed to move forward within the next month for the best chances of success. She'd had her 6-week postpartum checkup and been cleared for all normal activities. Everything was in place. The only missing piece was me. I asked her what would happen if I said no. She said honestly that they'd probably have to let the embryo go and accept being a one-child family. The cost and time required to find and screen a traditional surrogate was beyond their means at this point. They'd spent everything on IVF and Vanessa's complicated pregnancy. I was their last hope. I hated being put in that position, being responsible for whether or not they could have a second child. It wasn't fair, but life wasn't fair, as I'd learned over and over again. I told Vanessa I would do it on 3 conditions. First, she had to tell Dennis the real reason she disappeared from my life all those years ago. No more secrets between any of us. Second, she had to help me find David Brennan, so I could decide whether or not to contact my biological father. Third, she had to understand that this surrogacy didn't erase the past 12 years or make us automatically close. We would rebuild our relationship slowly, and only if she proved she was committed to being an actual sister. Vanessa agreed to all 3 conditions immediately, sobbing with relief and gratitude. Dennis looked confused about the first condition, but said he'd support whatever Vanessa needed to share with him. That night, Vanessa told Dennis everything about Mom's confession and the secret about my parentage and how it had driven her away from the family. Dennis listened quietly, then looked at me and apologized for Vanessa carrying that burden alone, instead of helping me carry it too. I appreciated his empathy. Over the next week, Vanessa and I met with the lawyer who'd drafted the surrogacy contract. The document was 40 pages long and covered every possible scenario from miscarriage to selective reduction to custody disputes. Reading it made the whole thing feel terrifyingly real. The contract specified that I would have no parental rights to the child I carried, that all medical decisions would be made by Vanessa and Dennis with my input, that I would be compensated $35,000 plus medical expenses, and that I could terminate the pregnancy for medical reasons if my life was at risk. Keith read the entire contract 3 times before agreeing it was fair. The lawyer explained the embryo transfer process would involve hormone injections to prepare my uterus, then a simple outpatient procedure to implant the embryo. If it took, I'd be pregnant within 2 weeks. The success rate for frozen embryo transfers was about 50% for someone my age. If it didn't work the first time, we could try again, but Vanessa and Dennis only had the 1 embryo, so there was only 1 shot. The pressure of that felt enormous. I signed the contract on a Friday afternoon with Keith and Vanessa and Dennis all present as witnesses. The lawyer notarized everything and said congratulations like we'd just bought a house instead of agreeing to create a baby. That night, I started the hormone injections. They made me nauseous and emotional, but I pushed through. 2 weeks later, I went in for the embryo transfer. The procedure itself was quick and painless, over in less than 30 minutes. The doctor showed us the embryo on a screen before transferring it, a tiny cluster of cells that might become a baby. Vanessa held my hand during the procedure and whispered thank you over and over. Afterward, I had to lie still for an hour to give the embryo the best chance of implanting. Dennis brought me magazines and water and hovered nervously. Keith had to work but texted every 10 minutes asking how I was feeling. I felt strange and disconnected from my body, like I was watching everything happen to someone else. The 2-week wait after the transfer was torture. I couldn't take a pregnancy test too early or the results would be meaningless. Vanessa called me every single day asking if I felt pregnant yet, which was impossible to answer because implantation symptoms are identical to pre-period symptoms. My breasts hurt, I felt bloated, I was exhausted. But was that pregnancy or just hormones or my period coming? I had no idea. Finally, 14 days after the transfer, I took a pregnancy test at 5 o'clock in the morning. Keith stood outside the bathroom door waiting. The test took 3 minutes to process. I watched the little window showing 1 line, then slowly a second pink line appeared. Positive. I was pregnant with my sister's baby. I showed Keith the test and he hugged me carefully like I might break. I felt numb and terrified and a little bit excited all at the same time. I called Vanessa and she screamed so loud I had to hold the phone away from my ear. She and Dennis came over an hour later with flowers and donuts and Violet in her car seat. Vanessa hugged me and thanked me about 50 times. I told her the hard part was just beginning, that being pregnant was going to be difficult and I'd need support. She promised she'd be there for everything, every doctor's appointment, every ultrasound, every moment. I wanted to believe her. The first trimester was brutal. Morning sickness hit me hard, and I spent weeks feeling constantly nauseous. Keith would hold my hair back while I threw up before work. Vanessa texted constantly asking how I felt and if I needed anything. She brought me ginger tea and crackers and magazines. She was trying so hard to be helpful that it was almost annoying. At 8 weeks, we heard the heartbeat for the first time. I lay on the exam table with the ultrasound wand pressed against my still flat stomach while the technician moved it around searching. Then, the room filled with the rapid thump-thump-thump of a tiny heart beating. Vanessa started crying immediately. Dennis put his arm around her. Keith squeezed my hand. I stared at the ceiling trying to process the fact that there was a living thing inside me with its own heartbeat. The genetic testing came back at 12 weeks showing the baby was a healthy boy. Vanessa and Dennis were thrilled. They'd have one of each, their perfect family. I felt happy for them, but also strange about carrying a boy. My miscarriage had been a girl, and some part of me had been grieving a daughter. Now I was growing a son who wouldn't be mine. The psychological complexity was exhausting. Around 15 weeks, Vanessa started showing me paint samples for the nursery and asking my opinion on cribs and strollers. I told her gently that I didn't want to be that involved in decorating because it made the whole thing feel too personal. She looked hurt but backed off. Dennis called me later to apologize, saying Vanessa was just excited and sometimes forgot appropriate boundaries. I appreciated him running interference. The second trimester was easier physically, but harder emotionally. My body was changing in visible ways now, my belly growing, my clothes not fitting. People at work started noticing and asking about the pregnancy. I'd practiced a simple explanation about carrying a baby for my sister, but saying it out loud to near strangers felt invasive and weird. Some people thought it was beautiful. Others looked uncomfortable and changed the subject. At 20 weeks, we had the anatomy scan where they checked all the baby's organs and measurements. Everything looked perfect. The technician showed us his tiny hands and feet, his spine, his face in profile. He looked like a real baby instead of a blob, which made everything feel more real. Vanessa asked if she could have one of the ultrasound photos, and I said she could have them all. They were her baby's first pictures, not mine. Keith asked me that night if I was okay. Really okay. I told him honestly that I didn't know. Some days I felt fine about the surrogacy, proud even, like I was doing something meaningful. Other days I resented the whole situation and wished I'd never agreed to it. He said those feelings were probably normal. I said nothing about this situation was normal. The baby started kicking at 22 weeks. The first time I felt movement, I was sitting at my desk at work. It felt like bubbles or butterflies, gentle little thumps from inside. I texted Vanessa immediately, and she called me crying with happiness. She said she wished she could feel it too. I felt guilty about experiencing something she couldn't, even though that was the whole point of the surrogacy. She couldn't carry this baby, so I was doing it for her. As my belly grew bigger, the surrogacy became impossible to hide. Extended family started finding out, including my mom. She called me drunk one night demanding to know if it was true that I was pregnant with Vanessa's baby. I confirmed it was true. She went on a rant about how stupid I was to let Vanessa manipulate me, how my sister had abandoned us and didn't deserve my help, how I was going to ruin my body for someone who didn't care about me. I hung up on her. Keith found me crying on the bathroom floor for the second time in this whole mess. He said we didn't have to keep doing this if it was too hard, that I could still back out. I told him it was too late, the baby was growing, Vanessa was counting on me, and we'd signed a contract. I had to follow through. The third trimester was physically miserable. My back hurt constantly. I couldn't sleep. My feet swelled. I developed gestational diabetes and had to monitor my blood sugar 4 times a day. Vanessa came to every single doctor's appointment like she'd promised, but now her presence felt suffocating instead of supportive. She asked questions about my diet and exercise and medications like she was supervising me. I snapped at her one day that I was handling everything fine and she needed to trust me. At 32 weeks, I started having Braxton Hicks contractions that scared me. We went to the hospital thinking I might be in early labor, but the doctor said it was false labor and sent me home. Vanessa looked terrified the entire time, clutching Violet and watching the monitors showing the baby's heartbeat. Dennis tried to keep her calm. Keith held my hand through all of it. When we got home that night, I broke down completely. I told Keith I couldn't do this anymore, that I felt trapped in a body that wasn't mine carrying a baby that wasn't mine for a sister who'd abandoned me for 12 years. All the money in the world wasn't worth this feeling. Keith let me cry and said whatever I needed to do, he'd support me, but we both knew I wasn't really going to quit. I was 32 weeks pregnant. The baby was viable. Backing out now would be cruel. Vanessa called the next day to apologize for hovering too much. She said she knew she was being overbearing, but she was scared something would go wrong and she'd lose this baby too. I asked what she meant by two. She admitted she'd had 2 miscarriages before the successful IVF pregnancy with Violet, losses she'd never told me about because we weren't speaking. The guilt of not being there for her during those losses made me feel worse. At 36 weeks, my doctor said the baby could come anytime now. Vanessa started calling me multiple times a day asking if I was having contractions. I wasn't, but her anxiety was making me anxious. Dennis apologized again for her behavior. I told him I understood she was excited and nervous, but I needed some space. He promised to talk to her. 2 days later, I woke up at 4 a.m. with real contractions, the kind that made me gasp and grab the bed frame. Keith woke up immediately and started timing them. They were 8 minutes apart. We called Vanessa and Dennis and they met us at the hospital 30 minutes later. The labor progressed quickly. By noon, I was fully dilated and ready to push. Vanessa stood on one side of me holding my hand, Keith on the other side. Dennis waited outside with Violet. The doctor coached me through pushing, and after 45 minutes of the hardest physical work I'd ever done, a baby boy slid out into the world. He cried immediately, loud and strong. The nurses cleaned him off and placed him directly on Vanessa's chest instead of mine. She sobbed while holding him, thanking me over and over. I felt exhausted and empty, and relieved it was over. They took the baby to do all the newborn tests while I delivered the placenta and got stitched up. Keith stayed with me while Vanessa and Dennis went to the nursery. I asked him if he thought I'd made the right choice doing this. He said he thought I'd done something incredibly difficult and generous, and that whatever I was feeling was valid. I felt weird about not holding the baby, about not having those first bonding moments. The nurses kept asking if I wanted to see him, and I kept saying no. Finally, Keith said, maybe I should hold him once, just to have closure. They brought him to me wrapped in a blue blanket. He was tiny and perfect with a shock of dark hair. I held him for maybe 2 minutes, looking at his face, before handing him back to the nurse. That was enough. Vanessa and Dennis named him Oliver. They brought Violet to meet her baby brother and took 1,000 photos. I spent one night in the hospital before going home. Vanessa wanted me to stay involved in Oliver's life, but I told her I needed some distance at first. She looked hurt, but said she understood. The postpartum recovery was harder than I expected. My body hurt and leaked and felt wrong. Keith helped me with everything, being endlessly patient. The $35,000 payment came through, and we paid off most of his student loans like we'd planned. Vanessa sent me photos of Oliver every day, but I couldn't look at them yet. Keith asked if I regretted the surrogacy. I said I didn't regret it exactly, but I felt complicated about the whole thing. I'd created a family for Vanessa and Dennis. I'd given Violet a brother, but I'd also put my body through trauma for people who'd hurt me. The money helped financially, but couldn't erase the emotional complexity. 3 months after Oliver's birth, Vanessa called asking if I wanted to come meet him properly. I agreed reluctantly. Seeing Oliver in person was strange. He looked nothing like me, which made sense since he had no genetic connection to me. But he also looked nothing like Vanessa. He looked like Dennis. I held him for a few minutes and felt nothing except relief that he was healthy. Vanessa watched my face carefully and asked if I was okay. I said I was fine, that I was glad he was here and thriving, but I wasn't his mother and didn't want to be. She nodded and said she understood. Over the next year, Vanessa and I built a careful relationship. We talked once a week and saw each other once a month. It wasn't the close sisterhood some people had, but it was something. She'd kept her promises about helping me find David Brennan, though I ultimately decided not to contact him. Knowing his name and location was enough. The surrogacy changed everything between us. Not necessarily in a good way, but in a permanent way. We were bonded now by Oliver's existence, by the fact that I'd literally carried her son inside my body. Keith and I eventually got married in a small ceremony. Vanessa and Dennis came. Oliver was 2 years old, running around the reception with Violet chasing him. Watching them play, I felt a weird mix of pride and distance. I'd helped create that little boy, helped give him life, but he wasn't mine and never would be. Sometimes people asked if I'd ever be a surrogate again, and I laughed. Once was enough, more than enough. The experience taught me that family was complicated and forgiveness was possible, but never simple. Vanessa would never be the sister I'd needed 12 years ago when she disappeared, but she was the sister I had now, flawed and present and trying. That had to be enough. The scars from pregnancy faded over time, thin silver lines on my belly that reminded me of what I'd done. Keith said they were beautiful. I said they were just scars. Every few months, Vanessa posted photos of Oliver on social media with long captions about how grateful she was for the gift I'd given her. I never read them. If you're still here, you're a true fan. Show some support with a like and subscribe to catch the next one.